heard the term transformative learning? Some of you have. It's a fairly popular theory in the educational world, but not necessarily, it hasn't really gotten out there to other areas. But basically, a lot of what transformative learning is really common sense. And it's things that we do or know we inherently should do, but some of this is the reasoning behind it. So I'm going to talk today about Mezirow, Frere, God, and free will. Because transformative learning, Mezirow was actually the father of transformative learning, and he had some ideas about God that I want to talk about as well. Because you don't see God in educational theory very often. So what we're going to talk about today is what is transformative learning? Who has to transform? Is it the student? Is it the faculty member? Is it both? Is it the educational system as a whole? Changes in education that are driving some of these movements. Mezirow and Frere, and a little bit about them since they have originated these theories. I'm going to talk about technology and transformation because technology has caused even more transformation in education than we have experienced in hundreds of years. We taught the same way pretty much from the beginning until we hit about 1990. Then everything really started to change very, very rapidly. How transformation can happen, and are you ready to transform? We're actually going to do an exercise today. I have a colleague that I work with at the University of Wyoming all the time, and when I went to do this, she said to me, transformative learning is a qualitative thing. You cannot measure it. Well, I'm going to try, and we're going to see how we do with it today. And I'm not going to publish your answers, but you are going to be my pilot study for my research, and then I'm going to take it on and do it. So I really need your feedback on my instrument. If you just don't mind even emailing me afterward, because I'm at the point where I want people to look at it to make sure that the questions aren't confusing. So what does transformation mean? Can somebody tell me what transformation is? What do you think of when you think of transformation?
Complete change.
Complete change. And I'm going to show you what I think of transformation in a minute. Anybody else think of anything but complete change? When you transform, are you better? Are you worse? I think we usually think when we transform, we're actually better. According to dictionary.com, it means a thorough or dramatic change in form or appearance. Caterpillar to butterfly. Are you a caterpillar or are you a butterfly? I think at times we're all caterpillars, and then at times we maybe are all butterflies. It really depends on the day. And what does transformative learning mean? If you take the definition of transformation, which means to change, what does transformative learning mean? According to Mezirow, who is the father of transformative learning, it means knowledge that's constructed by an individual in relation to others. And this is really the core of adult development. And when I say the core of adult development, I'm not just talking about adult students. I'm talking about people who are 18 years old who are coming to college for the first time because they're transitioning into adulthood. Transformational learning only occurs when a person learns to self-reflect and they evaluate their experiences and the environment around them. Basically, transformative learning occurs as we mature. And some people will do it a lot faster than others, and some people never will. It really depends if people can get into the real reason that they're getting educated. Are they getting educated because their parents told them to? Are they getting educated so they can party and drink all day? Not at LETU, but maybe at other schools. Why are they getting an education? And are they getting an education for grades, or are they getting an education for knowledge? And there's a big difference between those two things. Are all of you familiar with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning? Are you familiar with that book? That is absolutely one of my favorite books. I really am a Holocaust historian person. In fact, one of these days I'm going to go back and get a certificate in Holocaust studies because I'm so fascinated by that. And that's probably when I was a little girl. I grew up with people, because I grew up in ethnic Pennsylvania, that had tattoos. And when I grew up Catholic, when I got First Holy Communion, some Jewish people gave me Jewish Stars of David, and I liked those better, so I always thought I wanted to be Jewish. So I think that's probably why, when I was little, I think that's why I liked Viktor Frankl's work so much. But traditional learning is based on adaptation. When we traditionally learn, it's more or less like I'm talking to you today. because it's hard for me to do transformative things. We're going to do that at the end. But we are used to an educational system where somebody feeds us and we adapt. I go to a professor's class that day. My whole goal as a student is to try to figure out how he wants things done so that I can get an A. It's kind of like being a teenager and you're under peer pressure to fit in, and you do things you normally wouldn't do, but you do that because that's what's expected. So basically what it comes down to is if a student in the past was told, you're terrible in math, you're terrible in math, you're terrible in math, it's self-fulfilling. They will be terrible in math, even though underneath they might be potentially a math genius, because a lot of what is said to us as we mature, a lot of what we self-reflect and think about ourselves actually identifies how we interact in the educational process. And it's not until we get to adulthood that we may overcome this, and based on life and experience. You know, a lot of people that go to college initially fail out and come back as an adult and they have a totally different perspective about it. And that's because in some respects they have learned to transform. The key is to try to get people to transform as early as possible, because if you can get them to transform very early, they're going to have a better educational experience and they're going to be lifelong learners. So who has to transform in the learning process? You tell me. Both. Exactly. And your name is upside down. Daniel. Daniel, it is absolutely, positively both. But why? Why do both have to transform?
New knowledge.
New knowledge. Anything else? Why else does somebody think? Why do faculty have to transform?
New methods of teaching.
Methods of teaching. Why can't we just do what we've always done? Why?
Because you to bring your students to that new scenario.
Exactly, because students have expectations of us as well. Especially this new generation that are very technologically savvy, they have definitive expectations from us. So that's why it takes synergy from both of us, the faculty member and the student, for learning to occur, for knowledge to be gained, rather than grades given and A's received. Which A's are great. I mean, I wanted A's. I tried my best, but that's not really what learning is necessarily all about. You can have a class where you get a C or a D, and you might learn more in that class than you ever learned in a class that you got an A or a B in. So we've undergone in education very philosophical changes in the last few decades. We moved from the sage on the stage, or the chalk and talk, I think is something I heard recently. Was that what it was, Matthew? Chalk and talk? To mentor. Knowledge is not unidirectional. We don't feed knowledge into our students. We share knowledge with our students, and they share knowledge back with us as well. Also, students view themselves as customers of universities. If we don't change and transform to what the expectations is to the upcoming generations, they can take their financial aid dollars and go somewhere else. And they will. And maybe they won't do it today, maybe they won't do it tomorrow, but a decade from now, maybe 2 decades from now, that could potentially happen as organizations and education don't change. And I think, although I hope not, you're going to see a lot of flux in higher education. And some organizations and some universities are not going to be in existence after this all plays out. We're dealing with a different generation, and that's basically what it comes down to. And I'm sure that when I was coming up and I was 18, 19, the people before me thought that we were a different generation as well. But the problem is technology plays such a big part in this today. So the whole goal is we want to lead them to self-actualization. If you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs back from basic psychology, that's basically what this is about. We're trying to go from survival and safety up into self-actualization in education. The other issues is knowledge is just not something out there to be taken in. Knowledge has to be something that we try to make sense of. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge is not necessarily good, especially these days with education costing a lot of money and people being very careful about where they're going. They're going to school to make sense of life, to learn how to do things. So this becomes, when you self-actualize and transform, it becomes more of an internal thing than an external thing. So the professor's praise is nice, but maybe not required, or that A is nice, but maybe not required. And this is a tough place to be for those of us that grew up with numbers and GPAs and all these things. But again, in order for education to be meaningful for a student, it has to be relevant, it has to be purposeful. There has to be a purpose. And there's some things that we teach that students do not see purpose in. I was a clinical lab science. Did I see purpose in world history? Probably not initially, but there was a lot of purpose there because it let me know how the world around you works. And that's very important as you deal with people, as you deal with things that happen, it gives you a different perspective. It also must illuminate qualities of personal importance. The student has to find something to hold on to. No matter how hard it is for them, no matter how difficult it is for them to absorb and learn, there's got to be something there they can hold on to. And education should always challenge personal assumptions, beliefs, and images of yourself and the world. That's what education is all about. And every time I teach a class, somebody challenges my beliefs and images and things like that. It's a two-way street, especially if it's working properly. This does not mean, and I want to make sure that I really stress this doesn't mean that we compromise our standards at all. In fact, if we can get to this point in transformation, our standards actually might even be higher because our standards are going to be actual learning and useful knowledge, which I think we all actually strive for, but I don't know that our students always strive for that. There's also environmental changes. Students have been very disheartened. Students now go to college, get a degree, and they cannot get a job. And some of that is student choice. If you go and get a degree at Harvard in art history, the best you're going to probably do is $26,000 a year. But a lot of students are going to college because they figure they can just go back and get a job in the economy because it's going to take, they're going to make just as much money and they're not going to be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in debt. So this is a real difficult change for educational institutions. In the past, when the economy was bad, students just flocked into colleges, and that's not happening anymore. Financial pressures, education keeps getting more and more expensive. It's difficult for parents to assist students, especially in our case, we're a private university. Governmental pressures, all the governmental look at financial aid and how that's handled, and how student engagement is recorded. Are the students there? Are they not there? If they're there, are they doing something? And now, faculty are being held responsible for retention, which is something that we never really did before. It used to be a student would come to our class. If they showed up, great. If they didn't, that was their choice. We might engage them and say, hey, you need to come to class, you're going to fail, all those things. But now we are responsible for that. We are being looked at retention. And if our class has a very poor retention, then we're being looked at to say, okay, how can you make that better? Are you doing something potentially not wrong, but could you do something different to make retention better? Competition, because education is no longer linked to geography. Back in 1950, 1960, if you were in East Texas and children couldn't afford to go away for college, they were going to come to college in this area. Now they can go online and they can take classes in China or Africa or Australia or anywhere they want. So we don't have this captive audience anymore, and the pervasiveness of technology has allowed this. So we also have to deal with it. The other issue is students are no longer dependent on us for knowledge. They can go out and get it anywhere they want. That doesn't mean that they know how to determine good and bad knowledge, but it means that they can go out there and get it. So you have a lot of people, and we've always had this, but who are self-made people who don't need to go to college and can be very, very successful. Let's look at the Steve Jobs. I don't think he had finished college initially. These people are wonderfully successful. So college does not mean that you get a ticket to the next level that you want to obtain. It does not mean that anymore. Students, according to Mezirow Freer, and we're going to talk about God now, Mezirow believes that students are too dependent on teachers in a traditional education model. They just depend on the student, they walk into class, say, feed me, I'm a vessel, and then that's the way education's supposed to work. And Mezirow said that does not work for several reasons, because if we do this, students no longer become lifelong learners. And ultimately, that is the goal. Education does not stop the moment you walk out of Eternal University with your bachelor's degree. It continues to go on in life, and if you don't learn to become a lifelong learner, you're not going to be able to adapt to situations that you're going to face in life. Also, they don't learn how to form give and take relationships in regards to the context of learning. They don't realize that they have a personal stake in learning. It's very passive. I'm here, teach me. Instead of, I'm here, let's work together and we can learn things. And students need to realize how learning translates to the greater society. If we look back at learning historically, what has learning done for us as a country? It has made us, although we're starting to not be this anymore, but it's made us the most economically powerful country in the world. China now is right on our heels. And why is that? Because part of that is because they highly, highly value education. And they value lifelong learning. And they value all the things that perhaps we valued in society but have started to fall away a little bit. And overall, students have to realize how it's going to affect their future. So I talked about Mezirow. He's the father of transformative learning, and he started his research by studying women in the 1970s when they entered the workplace. And his theories were based on psychology and science. He based his ideas primarily on Freire's conscientization theory, which is a mouthful. And Freire said that traditional education is like banking. Teachers deposit, students accept. And those who don't accept get nothing. And that's not what the learning experience is all about. Mezirow had several stages. And before I talk about that, I want to go back to one thing that I want you to think about. How is our secondary education model in this country right now? Would you say it's modeled the way Freire and Mezirow actually said, where students receive and teachers deposit? I think it primarily is because of, I'm an educator, so I think it is because of standardized testing. Standardized testing in secondary ed has taken us to, here's what they're going to test you on, let's practice, practice, practice this, and so you can pass the test so I don't get fired. And that's unfortunate for teachers because it doesn't teach them to learn. So when they come to us, then they really have no idea of how to transform and learn because they've never been able to do that before. So stage one is the intransitive thought stage, according to Freire, and the instrumental stage, according to Mezirow. And in this stage, students feel out of control. They come to college, something different's expected of them. They never had to do this before, so what do they do now? And Mezirow believes that at this point, students either believe their learning's up to fate or it's up to God. And Mezirow viewed this as very negative, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because we as Christians don't think that leaving learning up to God is a bad thing, but Mezirow did, because it's a sign of powerlessness, and I'm going to talk about that and how I disagree with that in a moment. But students are very fatalistic. They don't feel like they have a stake in it. They feel like what's going to happen is going to happen, and they have no control. And ultimately, students have all the control, whether they realize it or not. We all have control over ourselves and our own learning. They can't think globally. They think single-mindedly. And they're easily led, and they don't know how to be a change agent. They're trying to find themselves at this point. When you're 18 years old, did you really know what you were all about? Most of us don't. And so this is a stage that they really struggle. And in this, they're really trying to find out how best they can learn. How am I going to pass this course? What do I need to do? Do I have good study habits? Do I have any study habits at all? I worry, my son's in an early college high school, and he started taking college classes last year in 9th grade, but he never brings home homework, ever. Everything is done in 4 hours a day, and then they're college classes. And even though he's going to have 63 credit hours when he graduates, he's never learned to have to deal with all that homework, and I worry about that. But of course, we'll address that when it comes because I'm strict. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. I say that my caveat to Mezirow is that students can strongly believe in the intervention of God in their lives, and that's not a negative thing. That is a very positive thing, because God gave them free will. And this is what they need to learn to exercise this for their own benefit rather than detriment in their educational life. So God is the one that can help them get past that if they have a strong belief. And some of our students are very strong believers and some are not. And just because you're a strong believer, that doesn't mean you're not going to struggle, because you will. But I think you have a different attitude toward it. Rather than just being, I give up, what's going to happen, happen. Those with strong faith, contrary to Mezirow's feeling, might actually feel that they have someone helping them who's very important. So they might have a different attitude about it. But I still think we have a lot of students that are even here that are in that first stage. The second stage is semi-transitive or dialogic, and students have some thoughts about how they want to change the way they think about themselves in education, but they're really not fully formed at this time. They can't critically think. They can't evaluate several problems at a time, but you finally got to them to the point where they can evaluate at least one problem and get there. They'll follow a strong leader, but they still are not quite at the leader stage, and they're not going to be at a change agent stage yet either. And learners start to ask where and when learning should take place. Gee, I think that when I go to a classroom and I hear somebody say something to me that really works for me. So I'm an auditory learner and online's probably not the best thing for me. Or I'm very visual, I like pictures, I'm introverted, I don't necessarily like to deal with people, so online's going to be great for me. We start to learn about who and what we are as learners. In the third stage, which is called critical transitivity or self-reflective, we get to the point of global thinking. We can critically think. We can merge thought and action. No longer do we think or know what we've been taught. We can actually do something with it, which is that self-actualization stage that I talked to you about earlier. Students actually learn why they are learning something versus just doing it passively. They become active. So I guess my whole point in talking about transitive learning is that our goal as educators, I think, is to take them from that initial place where they come to us and take them to this place by the time they graduate, that they really become true transformative learners. What do students need to do to transform? They need to be motivated by learning rather than grades. They shouldn't expect to be given the answer, because sometimes there is no answer. Sometimes the answer is something they have to figure out for themselves. If it's a math problem, yes, there's very definitively an answer. But when we get into the social sciences or psychology or business or education, there are multiple answers, and they need to be looked at the different aspects of all of those answers. They need to learn to realize they have something to offer themselves, most of all, and also their peers. And I'm even going to caveat that to the professor as well. The professor is not the only person at this point that has knowledge. The student has some knowledge too. They're obviously not as experienced or smart at this point as the professor is, but they have something to offer and they can realize this. At this point, they realize their unique God-given gifts. Let's look at me. I am not a graceful person. Athletic, I never was. But we learned to adjust. I was in the military and I had to go through those confidence courses. And that was like the worst thing in the world for me, because that was not my God-given gift. But I learned to go past that, and I learned to overcome, and I fell in a really bad swamp and got really muddy. But that's okay, because we're going to fall in swamps, and we're going to get muddy. But that's what needs to happen in order for us to get there. Also, they start to realize their weaknesses, and we all have weaknesses. And we need to know what they are, because we need to try to overcome them or accommodate for them. My weakness is athletics. The only sport I could ever play is volleyball, amongst my many, 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 many weaknesses, of which I have tons and tons. But there are some things I can do, and that's good that I finally figured out that there were some things that I can do. Because some of our students come to us with very good self-esteem, perhaps too good of self-esteem. Others come to us with almost no self-esteem. So we want them somewhere in the middle. Also, they look at their place in society and how what they do affects their actions as a whole. If I go out there and I drive drunk, I could kill somebody. if I default on my student loans, then all the taxpayers, including my parents, are going to have to pay that back. They realize that they're not singular, it's not all about them. If they default in any way, society pays. Now let's talk about the hard part. Educators also need to transform. Transformational educators don't just teach content, different content. They teach it in different ways. Transformative educators realize that people learn differently. So if you vary your methods in your classroom, you can become transformative and start to reach all learners. You also need to welcome true student discourse. You are going to have students that disagree with you, and you need to welcome that. And sometimes that's hard, because sometimes we have students that are almost belligerent. But, learn to use that student for your own benefit and the benefit of the class, rather than being taken aback by it. And Ferrer is one that really thought that this was important. You can affirm yourself without disaffirming your students. It's okay for a student to be smart. It's maybe okay for one of your students to even be smarter than you. Build on that, use that if you can. Maybe I think the most important thing, which can be very difficult to do, is reach out to the many, not just the few. Who do you teach to in your classroom? Do you teach to the smartest person? Do you teach to the struggling person? Do you teach to the people in the middle? Sometimes it can be really hard to decide. And in secondary education, we've decided we're teaching to the middle. And the ones that are up here are kind of left out, and the ones that are down here are left out. So what is the answer? I don't know. I don't think any of us know, but you have to evaluate and look at that as yourself as an educator. And another thing is realize you cannot teach things the way you always perhaps did before. Sage on the stage is okay for a while in short clips. You can be sage on the stage, although I'm doing it much longer than I should, for short times for people, and get into other things. I know students hate group activities, but it's good for them because they're going to have to deal with groups in life. And deliver education that's problem-based, practical, and speaks to relevancy. And do that as much as you can. And I think we really try to do that, but we don't always inherently think about it. Let's talk about technology and transformational learning. When you use technology, if you use technology, do not focus on how to use technology. It should never be about, let's learn to use iPads. That's not what it necessarily is about. Students might need that information, and you may need to give that information to some students, but let's talk about how we can use iPads to search for ducks in a pond. I don't know, whatever you're going to search for. Make sure that it's practical. Remember always that technology is a tool. That's all it is. Technology is not the end-all, be-all by itself in any way, shape, or form. When you're developing curriculum, when you're teaching a class, all it is a tool. And I think too much these days with technology being so pervasive, we tend to think of it as something that is separate, that is in addition to what we're teaching. And it's not. It's part of what we're teaching. It's just like when you used to give somebody a pen and a piece of paper. It's a tool. It's the same exact thing. And we tend to lose focus about that because technology just changes so rapidly, and it's impossible to keep up in a lot of cases. Students now have to have technology experience to succeed in life. And some of them are going to come to you and don't know how to do anything. So that's some of the things that we have to deal with as students come into the college environment. And technology can assist students. There's a lot of things that can be benefit from technology. Let's talk about your traditional course. Let's say you do some videos for students that are struggling on how to do specific things. They can access them anytime they want. They can remediate on their own. That's something that helps them. So when they come to you in the traditional classroom and they're lost, you can direct them back to that material and say, go look at this, see how this works for you, and if you still don't understand, come back to me. You're putting the learning on them rather than on you. Whenever, wherever, however, learning is here to stay. You need to realize that and use that to your students' advantage. I'm not going to stand here and tell you use cell phones for clickers in the classroom, although you can. Or you can tell your students no cell phones in my classroom. That's totally your choice, but students now and going forward are very technological savvy, and you can use that to your advantage. And some people think of it as a detriment, and it's not necessarily. Learning's not just in the classroom, it's on the run, and it always has been. Whether we think about that or not, how did learning first start to occur before writing? People talked to one another. That was on the run. We had messengers in ancient Greece and Rome running through the countryside to give information to other people. So it has always literally been on the run, but we think this is something new, and it's really not. Also, technology can disrupt learning if it's not properly utilized. You never want it to become about the technology. You never want to give an assignment and have students take 50 minutes figuring out the technology and 10 minutes doing the assignment. That's the opposite of what you're looking for. So be careful when you use technology, and don't use too much. I've seen people in online build a class, and it's a 10-week class, and they'll have a different technology every week. I've done that for an instructional technology class at doctoral level, but because I was exposing students, but I would never recommend that on a routine basis. If you're going to use the technology, do 1 or maybe 2. And that's enough for that student, because you don't want it to be about the technology. Transformative educators use critical reflection. They take time to reflect on themselves and on the students. And that's tough in our busy lives to think about, gee, did I really present that the right way when I talked about that in class 10 minutes ago? Or is this a different way that I could have done this? Also, we need to have a different frame of reference. We need to have a learning frame versus a performance-based. We don't want our students to perform. We want our students to learn. Require students to weigh evidence and assess arguments objectively. We all agree, I think, as educators across the board in the United States, that critical thinking is severely lacking. It's never going to get any better unless we push it and push it and push it. And students hate it. They don't like those types of assignments, but if we don't do it, they're never going to get it. Transformative educators open themselves up to alternate perspectives. They don't look at things the way they always did. They look at things through the eyes of the student, through the eyes of even an administrator, as painful as that might be sometimes, to get a whole view of the educational system holistically. And they learn how to build consensus by questioning, challenging, refuting, and allowing others to do the same. You have to let your students challenge you. You have to let them refute what you say. It makes you more mentally adept, and it keeps you really up in your subject area when students can challenge you, even though it might be off-putting a little bit at first. Mainly what you need to do is really reflect on what your own ideas are about education. If you want to be a transformational educator, you need to know what makes you tick. You need to evaluate what you think you know and what you actually do know. And every day, as technology transforms everything, I think that is essentially challenged. As to what I think I know, it changes every day. The 3 types of reflection educators should engage in. The first is content reflection. Content reflection is, what do I need to do with this content that I'm teaching to make it more learnable based on my knowledge, past experiences, and most importantly, on the group of students I have in front of me right now. Because every semester we get a different group of students, there's different dynamics. We have to do things a little bit differently. The next thing is process reflection. What are the positive and negative factors when I deliver content a specific way? I know I'm going to go back after I'm done here and I'm going to say, oh, I should have said that, or I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have paced the room so much because Ian has to try to keep up with me. But I'm a pacer, so I'm going to go back and reflect on what I actually talked about. And I'm going to critique myself, and I tend to be hard on myself, so it's painful, but I think it's something that we all do, because if we do that, we make ourselves better. And the last is premise reflection. Why does the way you're doing something have value? Is it because it worked in the past? Is it because you're comfortable with that and that's the way you've always done it? You need to just really look at that and evaluate why you do the things that you do. And that's what transformational educators do. They're always questioning, they're always wondering, they're always analyzing, and they don't necessarily assume. Columbia University published 9 steps toward becoming a transformational educator. Number one, remember you're not your student's friend or therapist. And this is important, but you can certainly be a mentor. You can be an important person in their lives. You can change their lives, and you do that every single day. All of you. I know that you do. Make your students privy to your larger goals. What are your goals for them? Do you tell them? Do you get in front of them the first day of class and say, you know, my goal for you is to everybody to learn. Not everybody get an A, but everybody learn something that's of value in your life for the future. That is my goal as a professor or a teacher. Warn your students that they're going to be receiving challenging feedback, that you are going to challenge them, that may make them very, very uncomfortable. But that's okay, because life is going to challenge us, and life is going to make us uncomfortable. Discuss your discipline's objectives. You know, we write objectives for a syllabus, and we talk about them, but do we ever really discuss them with the student? When I was a student, I would get my syllabi and I would look and there would be the objectives there. And I was educated initially in the military, which are very objective heavy. Nobody ever told me to look at those because those are the things I really need you to know. It was just there, I read them, and I moved on, and I just studied and learned things the way I always had before. And nothing was necessarily changed. So those are some of the things that you can do. Foster intellectual openness. Especially when students come to us as freshmen, and we all know that. They need to understand that college is different, and that the expectations are much, much higher than in high school. You know, it's very doubtful that when they were in high school, somebody told them why they're studying biology, why they're studying calculus, why they're studying all those things. It was expected if they wanted to move on in a certain field, and they did it. But nobody really took the time to explain why. We not only want history students to master facts about the past, but we want them to be able to evaluate historical evidence so that those same things don't happen in the future. I already said that I was very interested in the Holocaust. You know, we can really study that period of time in World War II. We want to prevent that from ever happening again because it was a horrible thing. But we as humans don't necessarily learn from our past. We put it behind us and then we move on and make the same mistakes over and over again. Also, they need to learn to argue. And some students are very uncomfortable with that. But argument makes them learn to express things intellectually. Step 6 is cultivate reflective learners. Just as you reflect on yourselves, teach your students to reflect on themselves as well. Create opportunities for them to think in more sophisticated ways. They need to understand their limitations, and they need to understand where they're good. When you present something to them, ask them to defend it. It's all about defense, 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 support, and reasoning behind why they do things. Make them evaluate things from different perspectives. And give your students meaningful assignments. And I think most of us do that inherently, but you know, multiple choice, 60 multiple choice questions are not necessarily a meaningful assignment, but we do that all the time with our students. Maybe a more meaningful assignment is go out there and reenact Napoleon's War with your family versus giving them multiple choice questions. And maybe it's not, but it's just something to think about. And I liked this quote by Mezirow, who said, learning to think for oneself involves becoming critically reflective of assumptions and participating in discourse to validate beliefs, intentions, values, and feelings. In other words, really look at why you feel the way you feel about education and how you got there. And are you where you want to be, or do you want to be somewhere else? I know for me personally, I always want to be somewhere else. I always want to be better. And I think probably that I could say the same for all of you. And sometimes it's hard because there's time factors, there's resource factors, there's all of these things working against us. And we never really take time to reflect. But reflection can do a whole lot for us. Transformative education is a journey, and it's not a destination. We are never probably going to get there, just like we're never going to get to self-actualization perhaps until we die and go to heaven. But you certainly can try, and you have to be ready. And how far along are you in your readiness to transform? And that is what we're going to do right now.